I looked into the eyes of a timid, pale young man in a cheap coat and handed him the letter that would save the world. It was October 1908. Vienna. The air smelled of coal dust and horse manure, a sensory assault that the history books never quite prepare you for. The young man's hands were shaking as he tore open the envelope. I held my breath. In the original timeline, the one you know, the one with the gas chambers and the atomic bombs, this envelope contained a rejection from the Academy of Fine Arts. That rejection was the spark that turned a mediocre artist into the most terrifying tyrant in human history. But not today. I had bribed the clerk. I had flattered the pompous Professor Green. I had done everything necessary to ensure that the paper inside that envelope said accepted. He read it. A smile broke across his face. Genuine, human smile, devoid of the malice that would one day define him. He wasn't a monster. Not yet. He was just Adolf, an aspiring painter with bad posture and a love for architectural watercolor. A Ugadme stranger who had simply encouraged him in the hallway. I watched him run down the street, clutching his portfolio, destined for a life of quiet mediocrity, smell of turpentine, and perhaps a teaching position in a small Austrian village. Premeditatone. I had strangled the serpent in the cradle without shedding a drop of blood. I tapped the interface on my wrist, initiated the return sequence, and prepared to wake up in a utopia. I expected flying cars. I expected a world that had never known the Holocaust. I got neither. The transition back to the present is usually instantaneous, a blink of disorientation, followed by the comfort of the familiar. But when my vision cleared, the first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't the sterile, conditioned air of the 21st century laboratory where I had departed. It was acrid. Sulfur. Rotting wood. Unwashed bodies. I stumbled forward, my boots sinking into mud. I was supposed to be in a high-tech facility in New York. I looked up. The facility was gone. In fact, the skyline of New York was gone. There were no glass monoliths piercing the clouds. There were only squat, brick structures, blackened by soot, huddled together under a sky the color of a bruise. A Zeppelin clunky, rusted, and loud drifted lazily overhead, trailing black smoke. This wasn't the future. This looked like 1950, but broken, stagnant. I wandered through the streets of this alternate 2024. Terror rising in my throat with every step. I found a newspaper in a gutter. The paper was coarse, the ink smeared. Famine riots continue. In London, the headline screamed, Prussian Empire closes borders. I frantically searched for context, for history. It took me weeks of navigating this dystopian cesspool to piece together what had happened. It was the butterfly effect, but not the delicate, poetic version philosophers talk about. It was a sledgehammer. Here is what I found. Without the Second World War, the massive, desperate pressure that forces humanity to innovate never occurred. You see, we like to think of technology as the product of peace and curiosity. It is in the radar, jet engines, rocketry, synthetic rubber, antibiotics, nuclear energy. The internet of these were accelerated by decades, sometimes centuries, because the world was on fire. In the timeline where I saved the artist, the 1930s and 40s were peaceful. Germany remained a quiet, slightly unstable republic. There was no blitzkrieg to force the British to develop radar. There was no Manhattan Project because there was no existential threat requiring a weapon of mass destruction. We never split the atom. We never went to the moon. We never built the silicon chip. But technological stagnation was only half of the nightmare. The other half was moral. This was the part that broke me. In your timeline, the Holocaust serves as a gruesome, eternal scar on the human conscience. It is the absolute zero of morality, the reference point for evil. Because we saw where industrial racism leads, the world collectively we built the United Nations. We wrote the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We dismantled colonial empires because the hypocrisy became too glaring after fighting a war against tyranny. But in this world, that lesson was never learned. Without the shock of the camps, without the newsreels of piles of bodies, the eugenics movement of the early 20th century didn't disappear. It fleury. it became mainstream science. In this peaceful timeline, the great democracies of the West didn't fight fascism. They adopted its softer sterilization of the poor was law in 40 states. Colonialism didn't end. It just became more bureaucratic and brutal. There was no civil rights movement in America because the minorities had been quietly legislated out of existence or into servitude, and there was no global outcry because there was no Nazi villain to compare it to. The world was a gray, suffocating place where cruelty was efficiently managed by the state, and then came the Long War. Without nuclear weapons to create the concept of mutually assured destruction, the major powers never feared direct conflict. In our history, the Cold War stayed cold because everyone knew pushing the button meant the end of the world. Here, there was no button, just millions of men with rifles and mustard gas. The war started in 1960 and never really ended. A slow, grinding trench war that spanned 3 continents, consuming generations of young men, destroying farmland, and halting all progress. The population was half of what it should be, not because of a singular genocide, but because of 80 years of malnutrition, Spanish flu variants that were never cured, and endless, pointless, conventional warfare. I stood in the ruins of what should have been Times Square, watching a line of emaciated workers trudging toward a coal plant, and I realized the sickening truth. The horror of the 20th century, the very thing I had gone back to erase, was a vaccine. The Second World War was a fever that burned the infection out of the system. It was the catalyst that propelled us from the age of empires into the atomic age, the space age, and the information age. It taught us the price of hatred and gave us the tools to feed billions. I had saved 6 million souls from the gas chambers, and in doing so, I had condemned 6 billion to a slow, hollow existence in a dark age that would never end. I couldn't live in this world. But more importantly, I couldn't let it exist. The moral calculus was impossible, heavy enough to crush a soul, but the math was undeniable. I had to put the timeline back. I had to become the villain. Using the crude, coal-powered technology of this timeline, it took me 5 years to rebuild a charge for my return device. 5 years of breathing soot. 5 years of watching children die of simple infections. 5 years of knowing that I was the architect of this hell. When the device finally hummed to life, I didn't feel relief. I felt like an executioner walking toward the gallows. I arrived back in Vienna, October 1908. The same cold morning. The same smell of manure. I watched my past self, a naive fool, walk into the academy to bribe the clerk. I waited until he left, smiling that self-righteous smile. Then, I made my move. I didn't need to kill anyone. I just needed to introduce a little chaos. I intercepted the clerk before he could process the acceptance list. I didn't offer a bribe. I offered a threat, posing as a senior official from the Ministry of Culture, complaining about the lack of standards and the admittance of talentless provincials. The clerk, terrified for his job, pulled the file I pointed to, the file of the young man from Brno am Inn. He stamped it with a heavy, red ink. Asterisk, rejected asterisk. But I didn't stop there. I needed to ensure the resentment stuck. I found the young Adolf sitting on a bench outside, waiting for the news. In the previous timeline, I had hugged him. This time, I sat next to him. I struck up a conversation. I told him I was an art critic. I asked to see his drawings. He showed them to me, eyes full of hope. I laughed. I laughed in his face. I told him they were stiff, soulless, and pathetic. I told him he should give up, that he was destined for manual labor, that the world of high culture would never accept someone like him. I saw the light die in his eyes, replaced by a cold, hard knot of hatred. He snatched the portfolio back, his knuckles white. "You don't know anything," he hissed. I will show you. I will show all of you." He stormed off, heading toward the academy to receive his official rejection. The venom I had injected coursing through his veins. I watched him go. I knew exactly where he was going. He was walking toward the flophouses of Vienna, toward the trenches of the First World War, toward the beer halls of Munich, toward the podium at Nuremberg. I had just personally wound up the mechanism of the Holocaust. I stood there in the cold Vienna wind, weeping, Not for myself, but for the millions who would burn because I did my job. I had restored the timeline. The rockets would fly, the atom would be split, the internet would connect the world, and the smoke would rise from the chimneys of Auschwitz. I had saved the future by damning the past. It is a paradox that haunts my every waking moment. Sometimes, the only way to build heaven is to walk through hell. And sometimes, the devil isn't an invader, he's a necessary maintenance worker. If this story messed with your head, you're in the right place. We explore the darkest paradoxes of history and science fiction every single week. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon so you never miss a theory. And I want to hear from you in the comments. If you had the chance to kill the dictator as a baby, knowing it might destroy the future, would you still do it? Let's argue about it down below. Drop a like if you enjoyed the narrative.